Hello and welcome to wherever you are and whatever time of day you've got. And welcome to my new office too. So my guest tonight is somebody we've known each other in reality, not just in this virtual world, for some years, I think, because I started the Worthing Skeptics in the Pub chapter in October 2013. And Max Kammerling has been a pretty regular visitor since then. Hello, Max. How the devil are you?
Hello, John. Nice to see you.
Yeah. And maybe, keep your fingers crossed, when the vaccines have penetrated enough, perhaps we can get back to the pub.
That would be delightful. I do miss my pint and a packet of peanuts on a Thursday night.
Yes, indeed. Yes, and it's really your field too, isn't it? Because you are a medico and you were the chief medical officer of Somerset before you retired.
God, that was a very, very long time ago. It was called Director of Public Health. I was Director of Public Health for Somerset for a couple of years. Then after that, I was Director of Public Health for North Somerset, which is the area on the outskirts of Bristol. And then moved over to Sussex, and then did some work at screening immunisation till I retired.
Yes, and I think you've been drafted back in.
I did for a couple of months. I was working with Oxfordshire actually on supporting them in their work, their COVID work.
Yes,
getting set up some of the testing centres for asymptomatic people. Unfortunately, due to family reasons, I've had to give that up this week, in fact. But yeah, I did that for a couple of months to support them.
Well, I'm impressed because I know that if I had to suddenly go back and do my old job, I wouldn't be able to cope at all.
Well, I'll tell you, John, the hardest part was, those of us who are retired, what it's like actually having to be up and ready to work for 8:30 in the morning or earlier. That was a challenge to do that on a regular basis.
Yes, I can imagine. In my case, it would be stopping myself from having a nap in the afternoon. I think
yeah, okay, yes.
That would be my problem.
Okay.
Anyway, we're supposed to be here talking about Jews, aren't we? Because in this series of Ask an Atheist, I've had so far the Atheist Pastor, an ex-evangelical, I think, who he actually studied to become a pastor. This guy, Australian, named Chris Atlee. And he was doing 2 degrees. He was doing theology and ministry. And just before he was going to take his finals, he read the Bible. And a funny thing happened.
I can believe it. It's a challenging read once you actually start looking at it.
Yes. So he lost his faith, and that's how he became the Atheist Pastor. So I've had him as a guest on this show. I've also had ex-Muslim, excuse me, Harris Sultan, he's a Pakistani Australian who campaigns now. He makes his job to YouTube on the subject of the Islamic religion. And then I had, who did I have last week? No, I can't remember. But I've got you now as a secular Jew, and I want to talk to you about the ramifications of that. Next week, I've got an ex-Baptist stroke Pentecostalist. So we're going through a number of people who have left their religion or never really engaged with it. So secular Judaism, that's a bit different from some religions, isn't it? Because while you can be a member of the Church of England and never go to church, except perhaps for a wedding or a funeral, you wouldn't necessarily label yourself as a Christian if you were like that. But quite a lot of people who were maybe brought up or born into the Jewish community still like to label themselves as a Jew, even though they're in no way religious? What's going on?
Well, it's a function of Judaism itself, and the general perception amongst certainly the more religious Jews that once you're Jewish, you can't give it up. You might be a very bad Jew by not observing any of the commandments, but actually you're still Jewish. And interestingly enough, there are various organizations whose aim is to bring bad Jews back into the fold by persuading them to follow some of the commandments. And it is the issue that essentially if you're born of Jewish parents, you're Jewish to a certain extent, whether you like it or not, and that label stays with you. To call it a label is slightly unfair, because actually there's also a description of Judaism being far more than just the religion itself, in that Judaism consists of, yes, the religion and the actions associated with it, but also the cultural heritage associated with it, the literature associated with it, a lot of the stories, the songs, which, you know, if you're brought up Jewish in any way, you will be part of your heritage, part of your story. And to use a word which you probably won't like, it's part of your soul in the more kind of casual sense of the word, that actually it's built into you in various ways. So just because you don't observe any of the Jewish rules, if you like, it doesn't stop you being Jewish, nor does it stop you having a empathy and a strong feeling towards the broad picture of Judaism over the centuries. Because of course Judaism has been expressed in a whole variety of ways, from the incredibly intensely religious to certainly over the last 150, 200 years, a much more open view, a way which is much more in tune with, you know, what people would describe as the modern world as it changes, and therefore has adapted itself very significantly to the modern world in a whole variety of ways. So yes, there's a whole variety of ways of expressing your Jewishness, some of which are more apparent and traditional, some of which are far less so, but nevertheless those are people who would actively consider themselves to be practicing their Judaism, and to people like me whose link to the practice is very limited and frankly goes up and down over time. I'm not actively involved at all in any way, but I have been in the past and I may again be in the future.
Yes, so it seems to be much more a case of being born into it than, say, Christianity, much more like Islam in that respect, in that from birth you are labeled, and if you're male, you're even branded.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it, John. I'm not entirely sure I'm comfortable with that wording, although I know exactly what you mean. Yes, if you like, Judaism is, you know, Judaism is a group of people who pass on their religion, you know, through the family, through their offspring over the years. It is possible, if you show wish, to convert and become Jewish and become a member of that family, if you like. It's not like Christianity. It's not a proselytizing religion in that there's any benefits to individuals who aren't born Jewish to actively being Jewish. In fact, the Jewish perception is that being Jewish is more of a burden or possibly a privilege. It comes back to this concept of the chosen people, and the question is, what are you chosen for? And the interesting bit about Judaism, that you're chosen to demonstrate, and I'm trying to think of appropriate religious expressions, to demonstrate the, you know, God's light in the world, if you like, describe in the various biblical phrases to be, you know, a light to the people, describing the positive side of God's rule, if you like. And that's a burden rather than a specific privilege. In case no real privileges with it, you can be a perfectly good, valuable person in the world and in God's eyes, if you're not Jewish, by behaving in a series of ethical fashion. And there are, for example, they're called Noahide rules, which are fairly basic, like don't kill people, don't steal, includes things like don't eat a limb torn from a living animal, but a number of fairly rules most people would see as being very reasonable ethical principles, and that still makes you a good person in God's eyes if you're not Jewish. Being Jewish as a whole series of other rules and regulations you should be following, as you know, in order to render you that particular example, which isn't often how Jews are seen in the world, it's fair to say.
Well, I remember a colleague of mine at one big school that I taught at for a while who became Jewish. And I think this was in order for him to be able to marry a Jewish girl. Would that be an explanation?
I don't think explanation. It would certainly be a reason, and it's what happens to many people. If you meet and decide you wish to marry someone who is Jewish, now clearly that's a choice for a couple, and some people may decide, actually, I'm going to move so far away from my Judaism that it doesn't matter what my partner is. Yes. Many people, sharing a religious faith is a very positive affirmation of their relationship and a very powerful way of giving a structure to their life, a moral emphasis to, you know, the children they may bring into the world. And therefore, that decision, do I, because I want to marry this person, or do we as a couple become Jewish, do we not become Jewish, is a very personal decision. Now, clearly, whether or not the love of his life would have married him if he said, I'm not going to become Jewish, is a conversation for them, and I don't know. But actually, they may well have had a conversation and decided that actually the benefits that they saw from Judaism were of great value to them. I mean, I've had a number of girlfriends in my life when I was much, much younger, of course, when I could use that in the plural, who, you know, I brought into my family home and were very moved by what they saw and what they perceived as being the Jewishness of the home and the warmth and the family commitments and the engagement and the education, the discussions that took place, which had a could take place in any home, but they certainly had a Jewish flavour, and many people who saw that and were attracted to it. I didn't marry them, I have to say, but clearly that would have been a conversation we could have had if we'd chosen to go down that route. So yes, some people will convert because they have fallen for a Jewish person, and in that discussion between them, that's how they want to live their life.
Yes, yes. Well, a lot of religions tend to use marriage as a means for expansion. I mean, not just in the reproduction aspect of it, but by making it a rule that you can't marry outside the faith.
Well, that's a rule in Judaism. You know, certainly in the more orthodox, more religious branches of Judaism. Sorry, I'm just surprised. Someone's put a question on the screen. I'm quite shocked to see that people are listening to us, given the problems we had getting it out. But where were we? Yes, absolutely. You shouldn't marry outside the faith, and clearly, if you choose to do so, that's a matter of how the level of commitment you have to religion. But Judaism isn't about expanding itself. I mean, Judaism is the group of people who considered that they were chosen, and I emphasize the inverted commas, because again, it's not a privilege in that sense, it's not a benefit, with a particular task to do in the world, and that continues. And yes, if you wish to join and be part of that, you can, but there's no urge to expand or proselytize, certainly in Judaism over the last few centuries. And of course, the user is saying it's a cultural construct, and of course, any religion is a cultural construct with all elements about it. And absolutely, it's there is a substantial element of Jewish culture which feeds into the religion and how Jews choose to live their lives.
What seems to be a bit different to me, though, excuse me, is how there's sort of two levels, isn't there? You can be seriously religious and Jewish, or casually and still Jewish, if you see what I mean.
I think our user talked about it being an ethnicity, and there's an element of truth to that, but it is certainly a cultural connection. And there's a whole series of levels at which people choose to express their religion, as there are in any religion. And Judaism, like any religion, has its fundamentalist wing, who takes a particular view. It has what I would describe as a far more liberal wing, which expresses this Judaism in a religious sense, but certainly would not have that level of commitment to the regulations. I mean, behind Judaism isn't actually a religion of belief. It's more a religion of practice, and that there are a whole series of rules and regulations, which, if you're Jewish, you should be following. And the simple way I describe it is, if you're very, very religious and fundamentalist, you see that as strict rules for following. The people at the more liberal end would see that more as a guidebook and a series of options.
Well,
those are my words. I'm not entirely sure any of the rabbis I've met would necessarily agree with that, but that's certainly how I perceive it.
Yeah, we have the what are they? The Reformed Jews, don't we? Yes. And but then we also have the men with the big hats and the curly ringlets nodding at the wall. They're described as either being the Haredi, which is a very religious, or Hasidim, which is a particular branch of the very religious, and who tend to maintain the level of conservatism, which means the standards of dress, for example, are related to that which was extant at the time those branches emerge into Judaism, which tends to be the middle of the 19th century, which is why they're dressed like that. And the rules about the they're called playot, those particular sideburns, and the beard, is our instruction in the Bible about not rounding off your hair or your beard. Somewhere in Leviticus, which is full of interesting instructions, which they take as literal instructions, things that they should do. And there's no doubt that gives a certain intensity to their religious expression, which clearly they perceive as being of enormous importance to them. And I understand that in Israel, if you elect to study the Torah, the government will sustain you. It's a job, and they will.
Well, that's a historical Jewish perspective. Judaism is a religion, which places enormous importance on studying the Word of God, which is both the Bible itself and a whole series of commentaries on the Bible, as discussed by rabbis. The whole point about the Bible, it describes a situation in time, and somehow those rules aren't necessarily applicable as the world moves on. And that was recognized, for thousands of years in Judaism, and therefore rabbis would discuss how can we apply these rules in the modern world. The obvious part being a lot of the rules were designed for when the Jewish population lived, purely in Palestine. All worship was based around the temple. And when the temple was destroyed, the Jews were expelled from Palestine. Then you have to say, okay, how do we express our worship in this way? The other, for example, there's a biblical line we all know, which is an eye for an eye.
Yes.
And, the rabbis realized that might be the biblical rules, but it's not very practical in the real world.
No.
So that, through debate and discussion, became modified in perception. An eye for an eye, but actually, if somehow someone takes your eye out, you don't take their eye out, you have to pay monetary compensation.
Yes.
So it's how that particular thing is adjusted to reflect the more realities of the world. The other one that I remember, which is I'm talking about, and I realize my knowledge is a little shaky, but it certainly talks about if you're caught in adultery, you'll be stoned to death, which is a pretty harsh punishment. I mean, clearly that's not.
That sounds like Leviticus.
Indeed, and it's not, and it's various religions deal with that. But the rabbi said, yeah, okay, that made the rules, but how do you know she's doing adultery? So it only counts if you've got 3 independent witnesses who saw her at it, which as a scenario is fairly unlikely.
Yes,
so you're taking the law, you're abiding by it, but actually you're putting various measures around it so it adapts to the realities of the life people were living at the time.
Yes, modernizing it. Yes.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, you talked about Reform Judaism, and there's a whole branch of what people in this country call progressive Judaism, with various elements of it. It has different names in America, for example. What people say, okay, how do we take this and move it very much into the modern world? And, there are people who would therefore argue it's perfectly legitimate to be Jewish and not keep kosher, for example.
Yeah.
There's things like wearing head coverings, which is very common, and people say actually you don't need to wear head coverings. They're taking that and saying, how can we use this in the modern world while still retaining some of the key elements of Judaism? And some of those are the universality and the universality of the ethics, which are articulated in some of the later books of the Bible.
Well, you mentioned head coverings, and it reminds me of, I think I was at an exhibition in London some years ago, and I saw these women with very obvious wigs. And I was told that they were Hasidic Jews and that they weren't allowed to show their own hair, but they had, instead of covering it with a hat, they had this rather ginger wig that was obviously a wig.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, there is the law, and again, I presume it's in Leviticus, I don't know, that if you're a married woman, you shouldn't shave your hair. Probably on a par with, if you're a Victorian lady, you shouldn't shave your ankle. It's the Canaanite process. And of course, women didn't shave their hair, but actually, now you're pushing my knowledge. Why did it become wigs? The message I heard, and it might be malicious, was that actually it was a form of female vanity. Let's still look attractive but not showing my own hair. That might be grossly unfair, and God forbid there's a religious Jewish lady telling me I've got it completely wrong listening to this, but my apologies. That was what we particularly said. But yeah, I mean, the rules are don't show your hair, so how can you manage that looking in a realistic living way, which still allows you to have a normal conversation with your husband, for example, and still go out without the complexity? So that's the rationale behind it.
Yes, it just seemed a bit sort of self-defeating to have to cover up your hair with hair.
It's an interesting dynamic, yes, and it's one of the issues that the point about the rules is they're there to be followed, not to be necessarily understood. So if you're like, the God's commandments are God's commandments, the idea you can actually understand and explain the mind of God is one that
mysterious.
Well, it's a challenge, and who can understand God's mind if you have that particular perception of God?
Well, I'm going to show a clip from a video here that it's really hot news. I think it was earlier this week, where it was announced that the UK, I think it's led by Peter Mandelson, the Lord Mandelson now, but a former Labour sort of early spin doctor, who he's championing this law which helps women who are Jewish women who are trapped in a marriage to escape from it. So I'm going to play this clip, and I'd like to hear what you've got to say.
The United Kingdom proposes amendments to help Jewish women deny divorce. So, the Labour and Conservative parties, Liberal Democrats, and independent politicians joined forces for a proposal that could provide optimism to Jewish women in the United Kingdom. They presented a motion for updating the domestic abuse bill to help any woman whose husband refuses to divorce her under Jewish law, thus proffering hope to approximately 30 women in the UK currently being denied a get by their husbands. A get is a divorce under halakha, which is Jewish law, and can only be given by a husband to a wife.
Hakala, not
Hakala.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. The refusal prevents the wife from marrying again under Orthodox law until they obtain a get from their husband. If he refuses, the wife becomes known as an aguna.
Aguna, chained woman.
Yes. Aguna refers to the wife becoming chained, prevented from remarrying or having children in harmony with her Orthodox beliefs. Members of the House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament in the United Kingdom, proposed amendments to protect victims of get refusal. So I thought was really interesting because, well, like, what standing does the United Kingdom have in Jewish law, you know?
And the thing is, like, it's just a ritual divorce, right? So, like, you could get or have a civil divorce where you're not divorced under British law, or not married rather under British law, but you can't remarry in the Jewish tradition, Orthodox. You could if you Reformed or humanistic without the get. And the thing is that a lot of those women that they're talking about are in kind of domestic violence situations or situations with their husbands manipulating them, like demanding money, demanding they drop charges against them. If they've got charges.
I wanted to read some of that. So
yeah.
Here's some situations that exhibit like how bad this get refusal can really get. Haha. So Lord Mendelssohn highlighted the situation where a woman gave, £150,000 to her ex-husband in exchange for her get, which was less than that awarded by the civil court, and being forced to sign a document relinquishing any ownership of the joint properties. She was encouraged by the Beth Din to accept the offer as a legitimate way to secure her get, but she did not choose to do so. A third woman's husband was being prosecuted for the sexual abuse of her children. In trying to secure her get, she was asked to lie to the police and tell them that the accusations had been fabricated so that she would be given her religious divorce. Additional financial sums were requested. The husband made further demands that were impossible for the wife to fulfill. So you can see how this ritual divorce is used to extort women.
Yeah, well, there you are. It seems that several religions want to set up an alternative jurisdiction to civil law. It's not.
I think that you're having it back to front, John. The alternative jurisdiction was in place long before our civil law was in place.
Yes.
And I suspect that particular law were completely in keeping with the laws around at the time, because actually the idea of a woman being her husband's chattel in a variety of ways,
yes.
Was in this country, sort of 100 years ago, if not later. So it's not that it's an alternative jurisdiction; it's preceded our current jurisdiction, and it hasn't changed. The point that was made there, I mean, there are a number of points. The first is what you're seeing here, sounds like, criminal abuse of the wife. And that's not part of Jewish law. It's an appalling way to behave. And the fact that they're using the religious issues as a way of abusing their wives is not a reflection on the religion. It's a reflection on the individuals. So also, we know that the most Jewish people would not, if you like, be bound or consider themselves bound by that particular ruling in various ways. As we've heard there, if someone wishes to get a divorce from the husband in the eyes of the law, they can. It's remaining within their strictly religious community and remarrying in that is the issue for them. And whether that's a function of some kind of control or a genuine matter of personal choice, I don't think we're in a position to say in any individual case. But yeah, it's an appalling anachronism and appalling abuse by individuals of their wives. It takes place in the religious context, but we know that there's appalling abuse of husbands by their wives across the spectrum amongst religious people and non-religious people, and this is just an example of it in a particular context. A very small number of women, but nevertheless any number is too great, who are trapped in what is essentially an abusive marriage by wishing to abide by various religious rules. So yeah, I don't think I'd say anything other than it awful.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you're right, of course. Religious law is the original law, and civil law came many hundreds of years later, and it's much more civil too.
Well, most people following religions now commonly would work in a much more civil way as well.
Mm.
You know, so you know, whether it's the Church of England, whether it's those Jews who do not follow the strictly Orthodox tradition, which, for example, would all behave in very different ways to the way that's described here.
Yes. Excuse me. Well, it's a common theme, isn't it, with religions, that they're all misogynistic, and is this probably because they were made by men for men?
That's a low. Yeah, John, that's a historical question. I find it almost impossible to answer because I don't have any particular insight into, for example, those issues around Islam or other religions. However, yes, they are misogynistic at one level, but certainly as they've adapted to modernity, they have become far less misogynistic. You've had the whole search of England, the Church of England conversations about female, bishops. We have female rabbis, certainly on the progressive side of modern Judaism. We have gay and lesbian rabbis. I don't know any gay rabbis. I know some lesbian rabbis. I presume they're gay ones as well. I just haven't met them yet. But and that doesn't cause the slightest issue amongst those certainly progressive branches of Judaism. It's a matter of utter boredom. The sexuality of your rabbi is irrelevant.
Yes, indeed.
And the sex of your rabbi is equally irrelevant.
Yes, indeed. So we have a question here about Islam, because we have three Abrahamic religions, don't we? Abraham started a lot of stuff, didn't he? Let's face it.
Yeah. I can't answer. Again, I don't know the history of Islam. I mean, there's no doubt that, sorry, I say there's no doubt. My understanding is that the Prophet considered that his religion was in a straight line from Abraham, and I believe that he did hope that the Jews in some of the cities in the Arab world, and I think the actual issue is Medina, but again, I don't know for certain, he did hope that they would follow his lead in the development of Islam, and was somewhat disappointed when they didn't. So there's clearly a connection between the two. I know that Islam, again, also respects many of the prophets of the Old Testament, and I believe of the New Testament as well, but again, not my area of expertise, and sees them as part of the story of the development of their religion. And there's tale of Esau, in the Bible, who apparently became the father of many of the Arab peoples and of Islam. But again, I'm talking an area which is not my area of expertise, know little about. But yes, there is a thread between one and the other.
Yes, indeed. and it's a thread which sort of bifurcates continually, isn't it, into various sub-threads, if you like. I'm thinking of, for example, the Kabbalah branch of Islam.
Yeah, you can talk about the Kabbalah. I mean, the Kabbalah, it's a particular thread of Jewish belief. I'm not sure it's described as a bifurcation, but it's a thread of Jewish belief coming out again of the Middle Ages. It's a form of Jewish mysticism, coming at a time when frankly, being Jewish in various parts of the world in the Middle Ages was a pretty ghastly experience.
Yeah.
And people were looking for various ways to make sense of the world they were living in. And that form of Jewish mysticism was considered to, was found to be enormously helpful by people. It takes, I mean, the interesting point that I will say is there have been various very robust and knowledgeable, serious rabbis who've described the Kabbalah as a load of old baloney. I paraphrase slightly. And certainly it's not a branch that I can ever imagine myself having any spiritual interest in, for example, but certainly it was found to be very powerful for people who followed it and studied it. And the message behind it is that, yes, there's the Bible as we see it and read it. There's a Bible as we can understand it, if you like, in plain thought. There's a Bible as it's described by the rabbis in their particular further developments. And then behind that, again, there's a hidden meaning known to people who are most knowledgeable, which is a kind of secret meaning, which is the Kabbalah, which ties and explains and works through some of the inconsistencies in the Bible. And I'm sure anyone who's interested in atheism will recognize the inconsistencies in the Bible, and tries to find some way of describing it. I mean, and one of the most interesting bits that I find, and I really only look at it casually in passing, for example, it has the image of, yes, God is so all-knowing or powerful that he's almost beyond our comprehension, and that is God. But actually what we interact with are kind of emanations from God, which don't have the same kind of which are somewhat less than God itself, but if you like, all add up to God. And that within that interaction we have, there are gaps in which things like free will, for example, can work and exist. That's a way of saying, okay, if you've got an all-knowing, all-powerful God, what does that mean for free will? An argument I'm sure you're familiar with, John.
Yes,
and saying, okay, how do we find a way of finding a space for free will in a description of the world and of God within it? So Kabbalah teases out a whole series of plasticities and mysticism. They did say no one should study it until they're at least over 40. So you and I will have to wait a few years till we're ready to study it.
I wish.
But I think it recognizes that it's extremely complex, confusing, difficult. You have to have a very full knowledge of the Bible itself before you study Kabbalah, and don't try when you're too young because it'll lead you astray.
Well, of course, the most famous supporter of the Kabbalah is Madonna. I won't query whether she's over 40 or not.
I go back to an original point where there are a number of very knowledgeable people who would describe it as nonsense. And the fact Madonna also studies it does not make me doubt the views of the people who say it's nonsense.
Well,
that's appalling. Actually, that's appalling behaviour. Madonna might be incredibly wise and knowledgeable. I don't know. My apologies if she happens to have tuned in by chance to this podcast.
It's always seemed a bit of an, I don't know whether it's an oxymoron or a contradiction or what, that somebody who supports a branch of Judaism should call herself Madonna.
Well, I mean, you have to accept Kabbalah actually is a form of studying, a form of knowledge of the world, which isn't exclusively followed by Jews. The learning, the studying has expanded into the wider world, and there are a number of other religious groups who have taken on board some of the Kabbalistic teaching and developed it in their own way.
Oh,
so in various ways, I don't think. Again, I don't know about Madonna, but my understanding, she would not see herself as being Jewish in any way, shape, or form, even though she studies the Kabbalah. It gives a description of God and how you can understand him better, which is some people would see as more broadly applicable than just to Judaism. I'm
learning stuff. Yeah. So
I said my knowledge here is extremely limited, John. So if you discover I've misled you, I apologize, but that's my understanding of a complex area.
Here's a big question. Look at all these words here. I bet it's a consequence of married men having, historically speaking, legal and moral responsibility for their wives, such that they were required to be legally liable for their actions. By making wives the legal property of married men, men could exercise the requisite degree of control needing. I think that should be needed. Misogyny notwithstanding. So I think this person is agreeing with our general feeling about such things.
Yeah.
Yeah. The degree of control even, he says. Now, we mentioned Lord Mandelson, didn't we? Peter Mandelson.
Yes.
In connection with this new law.
Indeed, yes.
That's progressing from the House of Lords and hopefully will prevent, I think there's 30 women at the moment who are being victimized by their husbands, not being allowed to divorce them in the Jewish way. But mentioning the Labour Party makes me think of the recent hoo-ha that they've suffered from in the matter of anti-Semitism. What substance is there to that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, but I'd say there's a lot of substance to it. It was investigated by the Equalities Commission, who certainly found there was substance to the claims of anti-Semitism. There's a whole issue about Jeremy Corbyn, and I think you could argue quite successfully that there's a lot of evidence that he has been and continues to be anti-Semitic in a variety of ways. I could go through those because I know it's a view strongly held by other people to be not the case. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he is. And do you want me to go through it, John? Will that be helpful, or will that just be combative if there are people watching this who are passionate Corbyn supporters?
I'd like to hear 2 or 3 of your points, if you would be so kind.
That's fine. Well, the first point, of course, is the one that he invited Hamas and Hezbollah along to the House of Commons, describe them as their friends. Hamas in particular, whose charter is very explicit about the fact that it supports the killing of Jews wherever they are. It's based on I believe, phrases from the Quran, but nevertheless it's re-articulated with the Hamas charter. And if you talk about killing Jews everywhere, it's hard to see that as being anything other than anti-Semitic. That's one element. He invited another Muslim cleric along to the House of Commons, who was certainly reported as supporting some of what's called the blood libel, which is the claim that Jews essentially use the blood of Christian children in some of their Passover rituals, a blatant lie used as an excuse to slaughter Jews at various points through the ages, including in England. And clearly it's still articulated by some, particularly in the Arab world, but I suspect not exclusively. And again, he invited some along to that lines. There was a book by an economist written at the turn of the 1900s, which expounded the ideas common at the time about how Jews were who controlled the media, who were devious and manipulated the monetary system to their benefits. Corbyn wrote a phrase, and he opened the book saying, "What a fabulous book." Okay, now, he might have liked some of the other ideas, but if you had any insight, you said, however, some elements are beyond the line. He endorsed, for example, the mural on the wall in London, which used grotesque anti-Semitic imagery about Jewish bankers, stuff that wouldn't have been out of place on the front page of Der Stürmer in Nazi Germany. And again, Corbyn endorsed and supported that. Those are how's that for a small sort of things which make the case that that there's a degree of anti-Semitism in his views of the world.
That's enough to be going on with. But of course, he always did seem to side with what we would possibly call terrorists. I mean, with the IRA, for example.
He did, and he was certainly around when there was a celebration of wreath laying on the graves of the terrorists of the Munich Olympic massacre. You know, where the brave terrorists assaulted, murdered, and tortured the Jewish athletes. And he was certainly around when that happened, claiming not not to be aware of what was going on, which seemed a little unlikely for a man of his presumed intelligence and
it's a
skills.
Strange tendency to want to go and make friends with the other side. Anyway, somebody here has said, why have Jews been persecuted so much historically? And it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, there's been Shylock and Fagin, and, there's very much a stereotype.
Well, there are all sorts of reasons. I mean, certain question, who knows why people decide to hate the Jews? But if we go back, there's a whole biblical theme to it. And if we take the religious theme, the Bible does the interesting trick of taking Jesus, who was crucified by the Romans for crime against Rome, and managing to blame the Jews through a piece of nonsense, which is the idea that there was this Passover ritual of allowing prisoners to go free, of which there's absolutely no basis, and actually getting the Jews to say, talk about Jesus, his blood be upon us and our children, which is just a piece of utter nonsense, but clearly allowed Christians over the years to see Jews as deicized, the Christ killers, and that was directly responsible for a whole series of brutalities and murders against Jews. And certainly, again, in the Middle Ages, Easter was a horrible time if you were Jewish, because actually, it would not be at all surprising if the priests in the church whipped up the crowd against Jews as they were responsible for the death of Christ. So that part of the reason why Jews were, if you like, considered, shunned and persecuted in that way. Some of the other elements come up, of course, because if you are Jewish and you are considered inevitably, to be alien, you don't follow some of the standard cultural norms. For example, Jews eat a lot, but they tend not to drink a lot. And in some societies, that's an example. They have kosher food, which means some of their eating habits are odd and different. Their prayers are different. Their worship of the Sabbath is different. So all sorts of things made Jews different, coupled with the fact that they were clearly Christ killers. There's a whole element that Jews were an other who were inherently guilty, which meant that they were isolated. They were banned from rules in society. Some of the work around Jewish work in the financial field was actually there weren't many other jobs open for them. They were banned from guilds, so they worked on that. And that obviously didn't work necessarily to their benefit, because actually, for example, I think it was Edward II who kicked the Jews out of England in, I think, the 13th century, having taken over all their possessions and their debts, which meant suddenly there were a lot of English people who owed debts to the king rather than to the Jews. And he used that to call in the debts and finance his wars. So all sorts of... So that's where you get things like the Shylock issue from. That is, were forced, so that's the right word, into the banking industry. And of course, being also people who weren't welcome in many places, there's a lot of linkages between Jews across the continent, because you're regularly kicked out from one place to the other. So the ability to function at that level was also considered alien by, some of the populations around them.
Well, you know what I'm thinking? This is just typical of the way religions of all flavors are divisive. They straw man, they like an opponent, an alien, a Gentile, an infidel, a heathen, and they like to label and generally prevent humans from uniting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a form of tribalism. I'm not sure I necessarily put the blame on religions. I think Brexit has had exactly the same effect, and there's no religion involved in Brexit.
Yes,
so there's an awful lot of stuff going on, which explains why people are divided and against each other.
Yes.
And I think to blame it on religion, well, I think that's questionable. People tend to do these things and religion is a convenient excuse for that.
Yeah, yes, it's an opportunity to polarize, isn't it?
Absolutely.
A bit like has happened in the States, where we have a right wing that's very divorced from a left, no, not really left, a central wing. They've just developed this hatred.
Absolutely.
So here's a peculiar thing. There are Jews who believe in Jesus.
Yeah, there are. I know, bizarre. But then, of course, Jesus was Jewish. He died a Jew.
Yes.
His followers, his initial followers, were Jewish.
Yes,
Even Paul was Jewish.
Yes.
And it was Paul who kind of adapted Judaism to make it more acceptable to the Gentiles, and therefore started it off as this worldwide religion. So to some extent, to say, yes, we believe in Jesus is not as daft as it seems, because Jesus would have seen himself as being Jewish, as dying as a Jewish person throughout his life. Even his, articulating what Jesus thought or felt is clearly a challenge for any of us. But I think he certainly functioned in a Jewish context, very much so.
Yes, yes.
And even his description of himself as the Messiah, the Messiah in the Jewish context has a different meaning to the way it does in the Christian concept, and it's very much more an earthly king than it is a religious king, or a spiritual king in that way. So the idea of Jews acknowledging Jesus in some way, but you're talking about a quack group of individuals. Quack being my phrase, and again, if we have anyone listening who's a member of Jews for Jesus, my apologies, but that particular perception of the world is one that most Jews would find bizarre and alienating.
Yes, yes. Well, it takes all sorts, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
So we're gradually coming up towards the end of our hour, and I like to try and finish on a lighter note. So what can you tell me? I believe that the Jewish concept of the afterlife is 7 tiers. Is that right?
Actually change. By Jews, we don't really care about the afterlife. We acknowledge that there is one, but none of us know what it is. And obviously, it's described in various ways by various people, but none of those descriptions are, if you like, fixed or absolute statements. Judaism is very much focused on what you do and how you behave in the here and now. And the afterlife, yeah, you die, something happens after. Probably if you're good, it'll be better for you than if you're not good. But actually, there is remarkably little emphasis on what happens after you die, because the importance is what you do in the here and now.
Oh, so there's no 7th heaven then?
Do you know, nothing I've heard about in my Jewish experience suggests that's a Jewish concept. Although, again, if there's a group somewhere who have defined that, nothing would surprise me. But I'm not aware of that as being a Jewish concept. I will immediately go and look it up, John, in case there's something I've missed. But I'm fairly clear that in my Jewish education, the afterlife was a matter of that really wasn't the issue. It's about how you behave in the here and now that is actually important.
Yeah, well, that's a good principle to live by. Absolutely.
Indeed.
So I'm going to say thank you very much, because you have been as predictably fantastic as I imagined, because you're very articulate, very erudite, and very good-natured too.
Thank you, John. Much appreciated.
We will have that beer in the near future.
I am looking forward to it.
And I'd like to thank our audience, small though they are, that they will be growing in the podcast form, and to remind them that if they've enjoyed this show, to like and subscribe and set the reminder, the notifications for them, because we do this every week. And next week we have got an ex-Pentecostalist stroke Baptist. I think he had a foot in both of those branches of Christianity, and he's going to come and tell us about his journey. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for being my guest, Max, and thank you for being an elite audience.
Farewell, everybody.
Bye-bye.